Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Hi Helen, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, I'm wonderfully well, thank you very much. Looking forward to looking at another coaching approach.
Yes. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the coaching approach that is time to think.
We are, yes. Yes, I'm very excited about this.
Yeah. So let's explain to our listeners, what is time to think coaching?
Time to think coaching is an approach that was devised by Nancy Kline. I think I'm excited about talking about it because it's not an approach that we use in our training. We pull some bits out, but it's not an approach that we teach. So it gives us a chance to sort of critically evaluate another approach that someone might come across out there in the coaching world. So it is an approach, as I say, that was devised by Nancy Kline, and she's been around a long time. She's sort of the Mary Berry of the coaching world. She is very much, she's American, but she's very much that elder statesman of the coaching world, and it's been around since the beginning, really.
The beginning
of coaching.
Not of time.
Not of time. Yeah, she's, I don't know, maybe 40 years.
Okay.
She's been around and teaching her stuff. So yeah, very much revered in the coaching world, and I think understandably, and there's very little to argue with in terms of what she talks about in the coaching space. And I'm quite often heard quoting Nancy Kline about the mind that contains the problem also contains the solution, often. So there's things like that have become phrases in coaching that you will hear. So yes.
So what is it about time to think as a coaching approach that makes it different to other coaching approaches?
I think it's different in that it leaves lots of space. So if you think that coaching really originated in organisations, where it's very much about what's your goal, what's the current reality, what are your options, how are you going to get there, off you go and do it, we'll review it when you come back. Very much a managerial approach to coaching, and this definitely isn't. It's about creating space for someone to think. That's the whole ethos of it, which is why it's called time to think. We create that space.
So more like the person-centred approach to coaching.
Yes. And obviously the person-centred approach to coaching, I think, is what does inform most coaching, is giving people that space. But it differs slightly. And I think that's one of the challenges for me of time to think, is the way that it differs from person-centred. But we'll come to that later. So okay. I think why it's different to a lot of coaching approaches is just the amount of space that's created initially to allow someone to do some thinking.
Okay, so apart from its likeness to person-centred, giving lots of space and silence for that thinking to be done, what are the key elements?
Okay, so one of the key elements is title of Nancy Kline's latest book, which is The Promise That Changes Everything. And the promise that changes everything in time to think is that you won't be interrupted. Okay.
So let me just clarify. I heard the promise that change is everything, but you said the promise that changes everything.
So by making you this promise, it changes everything.
Okay.
Yeah. So the promise is I won't interrupt you.
I see.
So the way a time to think coaching session would start is by asking the coachee, what would you like to think about?
Okay.
So that's the opening question, which is how we might well start our
opening
question. And then from there, the coach asks the question, and what do you think, feel, or want to say?
Okay.
So that's the next question. So they've said what they want to think about, and what do you think, feel, or have to say, or want to say? And from there, they will then talk some more about what they think, feel, or have to say. And then the next question is, and what more do you think, feel, or want to say?
Are they allowed to go off these questions?
Well, this is the formula.
Okay.
So
this is the script.
And I've heard someone who's a very experienced time to think practitioner say, well, I would just ask it in a slightly different way. So the emphasis in the first time might be on what do you think, feel, or have to say. On the second one, it might be what do you think, feel, or want to say.
Okay.
But it's the same question.
Okay.
Just to allow the person to continue with their thoughts, think to the end of their thoughts, get to the end, and then you might ask again. And what more do you think, feel, or have to say? This might go on for a while.
Right.
So that's the basis. So the idea is that they think all their thoughts and you've exhausted their thinking. So that's the point at which then ask a different question, which is, what would you like this session to achieve at this point? So they tell you what they want by the end of the session. And then you'd play that back, say, we'd like to achieve this. And then you ask them, and what are you assuming that's stopping you from achieving what you want to?
Okay, so a nice little gentle challenge.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we've done lots of really good thinking, then we get to the questioning bit, and again, it's quite formulaic in the questions that get asked. And this is the problem that I have with it. And there's some lovely stuff in there and stuff that we can kind of strip out and go, okay, that's great. And obviously what we find when we're teaching our coaches is that at the beginning, they rush in and ask another question and it moves quite quickly. But by the time they come to the end of the 6 months with us, there is lots of lovely space.
Yes.
And I think for me, where that space has come from is me reading Nancy Kline's books. I've never done any of her training, but I think I've gathered everything that I need to gather by reading her books. Or one of her books. I think they're pretty much the same book, but by reading one of her books, I think Time to Think is enough for you to get the essence of what it is that they're talking about. So lots of lovely space, but then we get to this question bit and it's, what would you like to achieve? What are you assuming? So when they tell you what they're assuming, so let's think of a scenario. Someone wants to have a conversation with someone, something about...
Let's say someone wants a pay rise.
Okay, so let's say someone wants a pay rise, but they're not asking for the pay rise. They're just sitting there going, it's really awful. I want a pay rise and I'm not getting a pay rise. And, I can't ask for a pay rise and... it will all go horribly wrong if I ask for a pay rise. So the question that gets asked is, what are you assuming that's stopping you from achieving what you want to? So that could be, the assumption could be, well, my boss won't let me have a pay rise.
Yeah.
I know him, I know what he's like, I asked last year, he didn't give me one. So I'm not asking because of that. So that could be the barrier, the assumption. And then the question that gets asked is, what is the positive opposite of your assumption? I think it's actually, what is your positive opposite of the assumption?
Okay. This sounds like one of those questions that might stop people in their tracks a little bit. I like questions like that.
So they're going to think, they're probably going to say, I don't understand what you mean. Mm-hmm. What do you mean? What's my positive opposite? But I think if we can get to that, then it's a bit like when we're coaching, we would ask someone who's got a problem, what would you like to have happen? Which takes them away from the problem. So the positive opposite, takes them away from the thing that they're saying is the barrier.
Because they don't understand the question.
Yeah. So the positive opposite is that I would speak to my boss and he would give me a pay rise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next question that get asked, the incisive question, this is labelled as the incisive question, is if you knew that, whatever that freeing assumption is, the positive opposite, if you knew that, what would you do in order to achieve your goal?
Okay.
So if you knew that your boss was going to give you a pay rise, what would you do in order to achieve the goal? And that would probably be, I would go and have a conversation with him and ask for a pay rise. So I guess it's that way of getting past those limiting beliefs, those assumptions that people are making.
Yeah. So it strikes me that there's only a couple of points. That's a form of kind of playing back what the person said, but there's not a lot of playing back here.
Yeah, and I think that's my biggest challenge with this approach, is that there isn't the playing back. And I think it's really hard for someone to see something from a different perspective if they haven't had that playing back part of the coaching. I think that's an essential ingredient in coaching, that if you miss it out, you lose so much. So just, if someone's talking about their role, to be able to go, okay, so what I'm hearing is this, but there's also this. And how do those two things fit together? Or just playing back what you've heard can give the person on the other side real insight from hearing back what it is they've been thinking. So I think it's great that they allow lots of time and space to do lots of lovely thinking. Brilliant. I love all of that. But that might be half an hour of thinking. And unless you're hearing it coming back, I think it's probably very easy to stay in your story and not venture away from what you're already thinking.
Because it's not, I think coaching's not just about being heard, but it's about hearing yourself back. And that's not happening as much in this.
Sometimes it's about just being heard, but sometimes it is about, okay, did I really say that?
Yeah. Is that what I meant?
Yeah. And I think that's where the new thinking starts to appear. So I think just getting to the point of, what assumptions are you making and, what's the positive opposite of that assumption? I think those are two great questions to ask. And we, in our coaching training, when we're exploring the situation, that's one of the questions that someone might use. So what assumptions are you making in this situation? It's good to know. I think the positive opposite question is a potential question that you could ask someone, but there are lots of other questions you could ask at that point. So that if you knew that, what else would you do? So that is just that. Okay, if you knew that you could run a marathon in a year's time, what would you be doing now? I think is a great question, but it just seems very formulaic to go through that series of questions and go, well, that's coaching.
So is that it? We've got to that?
Pretty much. And there's a bit in the middle about the assumptions that they're making, that perhaps something that someone comes back with might not be assumption, it might be a fact. So there's kind of facts, possible facts and assumptions. So I think you're trying to weed out what is real and what is potentially an assumption. But yeah, so pretty much if you knew that this was the case, what else would you do in order to achieve your goals is perhaps a follow-up question to the what would you do? What else would you do? So again, we're just exploring options, aren't we?
Yeah.
And then you ask them to write them back down and thank you, that's the end.
So this is, and it strikes me that oftentimes when you're doing something new, you do want a formula. You want to be told, how do I do this? So a step-by-step approach. Yeah. But we make it very clear that we can't provide a coaching script because everyone is different and every situation is unique. And actually, you might take a coaching conversation in one direction and I might take exactly the same scenario in a different one. So this is a scripted formula. And we've mentioned there's no playing back. Presumably then there's no space to say, oh, I noticed when you mentioned that, you became, your face lit up.
No, and I guess in that sense, I sort of don't believe it. I don't believe that can just be that. I think you've got to be doing something else. I'm not sure how you can be effective if you're not playing back body language or expressions
or someone's contradiction when they've contradicted themselves.
Yeah. So, and they might not be aware that there are assumptions. When you ask that, and what assumptions are you making, they might go, oh, I don't think I am.
And people don't often realise when they've contradicted themselves. Yeah. So it feels like there's something missing here.
It's the playing back.
Yeah.
It's the noticing what you're noticing.
Because you may be raising some awareness. The person might be getting some insights by being heard. We know being heard is healing. But there's no perspective taking.
No.
So, and what's also interesting though, and I think that there is an element that we've said, what would you do now in order to achieve your goal? That was part of one of the questions. But there isn't really a direction and options. There's no option generating. There's no exploration of options. There's no steps to take.
I suppose what if you knew that, what would you do? And if you knew that, what else would you do? You might generate some more options, but I think it's quite limited in the options that you would be drawing out. Yeah, I think it's one of those coaching approaches that makes it simple. So you could just ask those questions, go, oh, okay, I'm doing the thing, I'm asking the questions. But I think in order to do it really well takes a lot of time, and the circumstances have to be right. I think it's one of those that you could do this as part of your, and I've certainly used it. When I read Nancy Kline's book, I think I went on a bit of I'll try that. And there was one guy that I didn't really enter the conversation for about an hour. He just talked and he made sense of his world, and he did just do that new thinking, and he just spent an hour of thinking and said, thank you very much, that was brilliant, well done. So that worked. I did some research with someone else that I took a similar approach to. So it's about the time that I read the book, so I was kind of trying to embed it. And I did some research with this lady and said, what did you think to the coaching? And she said, well, actually, I think we wasted a lot of time in that first session, because there was a lot of time of me just sat there thinking and just thinking they're not.
Oh, interesting.
It didn't really go anywhere. Now, I think she did some really good thinking, so it did, but it wasn't enough for her. And actually where she felt she got benefit from other sessions where it was perhaps a little bit more interactive. And one of the things that I think the most important thing that happened in that first session was in having the coaching, I was watching her, and when she talked about herself, when she was talking to me, she looked down at the desk. And the thing that she wanted coaching about was not having presence in board meetings. Now, when I was talking, she looked directly at me. But the moment she started talking, she looked down at the desk. Now, I was able to play that back and say, when you talk, you look down at the desk. How aware are you that you do that? She said, I had no idea I was doing that. So, obviously, really difficult to have a presence in a board meeting if you're looking down whilst you're talking.
Yeah.
Now, had I been taking the time to think approach, I wouldn't have been doing that noticing.
No.
I mean, I was trying to leave the space. I was trying to have that approach, but there was something in me that, this is really important. I need to play this back to you.
Yeah.
I need to let you know what's going on for you.
So it strikes me that there's some really great elements of time to think, but if it was your only coaching approach that you had up your sleeve, you would be limiting yourself in terms of what you could do with clients and how you could actually help clients.
Yeah. Because you are relying on them to do their own perspective taking without offering them any tools, without any exercises that they can do that might give them a different perspective.
Yes. And as much as I believe people have answers within them, I'm a firm believer in we're making the best of the resources we have available to us, but there are always more resources available, and there are always more resources available. And so when we introduce a tool, an exercise, a concept to explore in coaching, that extends our resources. And it strikes me that this doesn't extend someone's resources in the same way.
No, I suppose if you get someone to think about a limiting belief and then change that to a positive belief, that is belief change work, and that could be what makes the difference. But I don't think everyone has that. And I guess this is the premise that Nancy Kline is working on, is that the brain that contains the problem also contains the solution. That is her offering. And if we accept that, then we're just going to work in this way. Mm-hmm. I think some people need a little bit more encouragement for that solution to come out.
Yeah.
Not for us to give them the solution, but they need different ways of looking at it to draw that solution out.
And so if you're not aware that you're looking down at the desk,
Yeah.
you have got the solution, but you haven't released that solution until someone points that out to you.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
And I remember someone who was talking about doing some future work, and there was a bit of it, it turned out she wasn't interested in doing. And as she talked about it, she played with her necklace and then stopped playing with the necklace the moment she finished talking about it. And I noticed that and played that back and said, oh, I noticed this. And what did that mean? And she said, yeah, I really don't want to do that piece of work. But she hadn't articulated that in talking about it. So there's something about our presence and our really paying attention to the person in front of them, which is what Nancy Kline advocates. But unless we're getting involved and saying, I'm noticing this, and I noticed you laughed when you talked about something quite serious. Those sorts of things, I think, are really important. And it just doesn't exist in Time to Think.
That's so fascinating. And, that's why we don't teach this particular approach in its pure form on our course.
We teach that ethos of leaving the space for someone to think. And at the point that you think you want to come in and have something to say, just holding back and going, okay, is this going to actually contribute? Or am I just best to let them think? And just leaving that a little bit longer, giving them more space. So I'm a real believer in that, leaving lots of lovely space. But we have to be doing a bit more, I think. So I saw Nancy Kline at a conference probably 7 or 8 years ago now. And she was just like Mary Berry. People just hung on her every word. The room was silent, and she talked for about 45 minutes, and no one said a word. And then she took questions at the end, and people were very respectful. But one chap asked her, this is really interesting, well, what happens when it doesn't work? And she gave a response that talked about a time that it did work.
Okay.
So it didn't really have an answer. It was a bit of a politician's answer. Well, let me tell you about this time. And it was just another time when it did work. So I thought, you don't have an answer to that. And I say I have the utmost respect for her. I don't, I'm not trying to criticize that. But in that moment, there wasn't okay, well, you could do something different. You could try a different approach. If this isn't working, try something else. There wasn't that. So I think, like you say, I think it's brilliant stuff, but it's just very narrow. And I don't think you could depend entirely on this for your coaching repertoire.
And that's why we like transformational coaching, because we can take parts of what work from all these different approaches and have them all in our tool bag. Yeah,
so when we started, we talked about this being very much like the person-centred approach, and I think it is, but I think the revelatory thing in the person-centred approach is that playing back.
Yeah.
And just letting the person know what it is they've just said. And if we're not doing that, then I think we miss a huge chunk of the coaching.
Fabulous. This has been such an interesting journey.
I was a little bit apprehensive about doing it because I really don't want to criticise a model of coaching, but because I think there's some really good stuff in there. And I think Nancy Kline's book, Time to Think, or her latest one, I think any of those books, I think they're well worth a read because I think she has some really interesting things to say. And I think if you've come from that managerial approach of just, so what's your goal? And just carrying on asking lots of questions and whizzing through it all, then I think this would change the way that you coach. But I don't think it's enough. So, I think it's a great thing to explore and gives us a chance to, say, a bit of a critical evaluation of it rather than, I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I think there are lovely elements to it, but also problems with just relying on this as a way to coach. And
I think that's very valid to evaluate
Good.
Things that are presented to us.
We'll see what our listeners think.
Yes.
I might get trolled.
You might do. You might get hate mail. Let us know what you think in a really nice way. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That's interesting to explore.
Very welcome.
What will we be exploring next time?
Next time we will be exploring a coaching tool which will be Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Oh, exciting. I think lots of people have heard of Maslow's hierarchy.
Everyone's heard of Maslow's hierarchy. No one knows what it is, but everyone's heard of it.
They just say, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, isn't it? And everyone goes, yes.
Yeah, I say that so often.
Yeah. And we make a lot of assumptions that people understand it.
Yes.
So let's explore it a bit.
Yeah, and I think people would probably say they do understand it, but then if you ask them what those levels were within the hierarchy, they wouldn't know. So we will explore it.
Excellent. Brilliant. I look forward to it. See you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.